Welcome everyone to this special seminar series. This is kind of an unofficial winter webinar series for the beekeepers here in Indiana and some folks in Ohio and others. Actually, this went out pretty widely. So if you're from elsewhere, drop it in the chat. Let us know where you're from. This is a really kind of a collaborative effort between the Southwestern Ohio Beekeepers Association. We got someone from Atlanta, Georgia there. That's awesome. So this is a collaboration between the Southwestern Ohio Beekeepers, Purdue University, the Beekeepers of Indiana, and the Patty, if I get this wrong, unmute yourself, the Central Indiana the Beekeepers of Central Indiana. There we go.
West Central Indiana.
Oh, thank you, West Central Indiana. There we go.
Right.
And today we're really happy to host Cooper tonight. Cooper Schouten, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Cooper Schouten. Cooper is an associate lecturer at Southern Cross University and a beekeeper. When I asked him how long he's been a beekeeper, he told me he's been one for at least 2 generations, and that's because he recently got his dad into beekeeping. So Cooper's joining us tonight from Australia. It's early morning for him, or I guess mid-morning for him, and kind of mid-evening for us. The reason he's here, he recently put out a paper called Factors Influencing Beekeepers' Income, Productivity, and Welfare in Developing Countries. I saw this paper go around Twitter and I really enjoyed it. It was a different perspective of beekeeping that I had never thought of. So I thought, let's get Cooper here to talk to us about his work. So very pleased to have him. Cooper, I'm going to pass the mic over to you. I will mute myself. And just one more reminder to everyone. We are recording this, so if your camera's on and you don't want to be recorded and put on YouTube, you can turn it off. And we ask that you just keep yourself muted until the end. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat during the session. I will be watching that very diligently and make sure we don't miss any. Greetings from Kenya. Oh my gosh, this is awesome. Okay, well, cool. I'll let Cooper take over. So there you go, Cooper.
Awesome. Thanks, Brock, and good evening, everyone. And for anyone that's on this side of the earth, good morning. I feel like I'm traveling back through time to be presenting. I'm actually it's Thursday here. So yeah, so my name's Cooper Schouten. I'm a researcher at Southern Cross University in Northern New South Wales, Australia. So I'm on the East Coast, right in the middle. I'm a beekeeper myself. I'm not running a lot of hives. I'm running about 40 at the moment. I sell a lot of new colonies. I used to sell a bit of some queen bees, but not as a big business. And my background is actually working for a commercial beekeeping operation. When I was in high school, I fell in love with beekeeping, working for an organic certified company running about anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 hives. So it was a lot of hard yakka, but I fell in love with being out in the forest and just being in nature. And I just thought, there couldn't be anything better than doing this. And I just feel so fortunate that I've been able to turn that into my career in lots of ways. So Brock, I've just had a notice saying that I can't share my screen, which I need to do. So let me double check.
One moment, that'll be on.
I'll handle that. I'll get it.
Thanks, Eric. Awesome. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about the 5 pillars for sustainable beekeeping. I might just get everyone to give me a thumbs up if you can see the slideshow on your screen. All good? Awesome. All right. Yeah, so I'm also the project leader for the Bees for Sustainable Livelihoods research group here at Southern Cross Uni. And we've got active research throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So I manage a team of about 35 staff in Fiji and Papua New Guinea and in other countries as well. And we've got activities about all these 5 pillars that we're going to be talking about today. So I won't go over them in too much detail, but we can chat about that at another time. Just on a personal note, I wanted to start, I like to make my talks pretty personal in lots of ways. This is a really important topic for me and one that I'm really passionate about, because beekeeping, I don't need to convince you crazy people that love bees how great bees are. But there's lots of benefits of beekeeping for marginalised communities in Southeast Asia and the Pacific that we may be aware of already, but some that we might not already be aware of that don't necessarily meet the eye. Approximately 1/3 of the world's population suffer from malnutrition every single day. There's about 800 million people in this world that go hungry every day, and some of those people are my friends. all beekeepers are brothers, right? And sisters. So I feel like a moral responsibility to help a lot of the communities overseas as well. And a lot of the research outcomes that we have implications for beekeepers in the States and here in Australia as well. So we're trying to understand how to better manage pest and disease and biosecurity threats that can be a problem in other countries. So I think Varroa is a challenge. Wait till you've got Varroa and Tropicalaps mites like we do in Papua New Guinea, for example. It's tough going. So all right, so I just sort of go over some of the benefits of what beekeeping has to offer in terms of a development strategy. So from the top, beekeeping can help to reduce deforestation. So if we have communities that have, obviously when we're dependent on our honey money for our main source of income, we might have an incentive to protect those forest areas. Lots of beekeepers do in many countries, but how they actually go about doing that needs better investigation. Like I was saying before, when I fell in love with beekeeping, most beekeepers I know have got a really good understanding of the flora that's around them and the creatures that are in the environment. So that's really important in keeping note of change in the environment. Bees are obviously good for pollination of agricultural crops, so about a third of the world's food resources. But for a smallholder farmer who's just growing some pumpkins, if you can double the amount of pumpkins they're growing, that's going to have a really big impact on their life. It's also really important to remember in some of these countries, honeybees are native. So more than, some of the areas I work got about 9 species of honeybees ripping around on flowers. It's a really fascinating places to be. And these bees are really important to sustaining the flora that's there. Bees produce lots of other products other than honey. As we know, we got propolis and beeswax. And beeswax and things like that. So these are opportunities for people to generate lots of other income streams from, candles and soaps and lip balms or surf wax and zinc and things like that. It's accessible to marginalized groups. You can do beekeeping on really steep slopes or on soil that's not very productive. You can have rapid returns on investment, and all the beekeepers here are like, yeah, right, I'm still in debt. It can have low costs when you're starting up in some situations. And it's non-competitive with other types of resource-intensive agriculture. Like, how much land do you need? If you have to migrate because there's a civil war or there's a big problem, you can kind of pick up your bees and go. You can't do that if you plant a whole bunch of corn. So there's lots of different benefits. This beekeeper in this photo here, he manages Apis cerana, the small Asian honeybee, throughout Indonesia. So he actually has a lot of cultural heritage values associated with that. So just as you and I go to the pub or we go to these bee conferences and we talk the talk about bees and it's a part of who we are, it's also a part of who these people are in many ways as well. And that's important to them. So there's lots of, and for these people, they don't have access to hospitals like we do. So, if they burn themselves or they've got a cut, they can put honey on it. That can actually be really important and stop that cut from becoming infected, particularly in tropical environments. So medicinal values is another really important one. So that's sort of why sustainable beekeeping. But what we're going to focus on today is actually how to implement it, because what I'm seeing all around the world is that even though, we've got Save the Bees and bees can do all these amazing and magical things, there's lots of people out there who are amazing beekeepers, but they haven't spent a lot of time understanding local context. I wouldn't go to, far north Queensland and talk to beekeepers about how they should operate up there, because I just don't get the flora there. I just don't get the pests and disease there. It's not the same management strategies that I implement down here, down south. And they're in the same country, So if you pile on top of that all the social and cultural, political flora, pest and disease challenges, marketing challenges, there's very different constructs overseas that we need to be aware of. And increasingly what we're seeing, and I'll show you some data that actually backs up what I'm saying, we're increasingly seeing lots of beekeeping development programs implemented worldwide. But despite that, we're seeing some major challenges. Attrition is a major problem amongst adopters. Colony losses are really high. Support for and coordination of the sector is ineffective. Production is very low. And so there's lots of opportunities here to create more vibrant and sustainable, productive, resilient beekeeping systems. So I'm going to talk about the 5 pillars for apicultural development. And they are education extension, nutrition, pests and diseases, genetics, and technology. So I'm going to talk about these from technology first, because it's actually one of the least important pillars in this. So I'm going to work from that one first. And the reason why is because the first thing that aid organizations do is they come to me and say, should we get some flow hives? what sort of hive boxes should we use, you know? So, so I don't know how many more conversations I got to have like that, but this is a great opportunity for me to start talking to more people and getting this sort of word out there about this. So before I sort of go into these pillars, I'm just going to go over some of the findings of some research that I did that Brock's seen online, just really briefly, as a bit of a background before we jump into those 5 pillars. So this is the paper that Brock found online, and that's the reason why I'm here right now. What I did was I looked at a whole bunch of papers online and I reviewed them critically they're all beekeeping for development papers. I was looking at more than 3,372 articles. So I screened all them and got them down to 48 studies. And the information in those papers looks at 19 different low-income countries and involved more than 4,500 participants. So it's not all developing countries, but what we're trying to do is get a bit of an understanding. Okay, what does it look like to be a beekeeper in one of these countries? So what we found was most beekeepers don't have many hives. They've got about 20 hives on average. But in saying that, how important is this for their income? It's about 30% of their income. So if I say to someone here in Australia, oh, you know, most of these beekeepers got about 30 hives, they're like, that's not an industry. What are you talking about? But if I said to them, oh, you know, beekeeping accounts for 30% of their income, that's heaps. That's a lot. That's a lot of resources. It's really important to them. Their production's pretty low. It's about 16, 17 kilos a hive. Obviously, there's a lot of variation going on out there, but this is generally speaking. And income's about $1,000 from their beekeeping enterprises. So, and the majority of them are doing this as a supplementary form of an income, about 80% of them. So only about 20% actually do this full time. And there's reason for that. So that's just some of the quick findings. Before so when I sort of mentioned that beekeeping in developing countries is becoming more popular, this is a graph about papers that are coming out on it. So you can see, obviously, there's just an increasing trend. We're seeing more publications coming out on beekeeping development. This is where the papers we're looking at, what countries. So when we're talking about beekeeping for development, you know, like sub-Saharan Africa is not Papua New Guinea, it's not Fiji. So if I'm going to look at this research and understand what these beekeeping systems are doing, you know, I can't apply all the same lessons. So this is sort of a bit of a map about where some of these projects are happening in the world, that sort of thing as well. This graph here is showing where these papers were published. So as we all know, beekeeping sits somewhere between forestry, agriculture, economics, crazy people, forestry, you know. So what that means is that when I'm having a conversation with people about beekeeping development, I'm talking to people that speak totally different languages a lot of the time. We've got people who are economists going in there and looking at it. They don't even know what Apis mellifera is. You know, we have someone who's in forestry going in there and they're telling us about what trees they need to plant, and you know, but they're not even aware of what timing the flowering comes in, and if that's any good for bees, for example. So this is a challenge for me in development, and it's actually a challenge in lots of other agricultural services as well, is about communication between these different sectors. This is one of my mates in this photo. His name's Solomon Loy. He'd forgotten how to make splits. This is in Papua New Guinea. And I came back a year later after we made some really solid splits and started breeding some queen bees, and came back and he was just stoked. He's actually got his apiary ripping again. He had three hives when I seen him. They were all dying and he didn't know why. All right, so this is a graph. I won't spend ages on this, but in that study, what I was looking for was what are some of what was the research showing me in terms of principles or, you know, situations or, you know, characteristics of these beekeepers that were significantly influencing their honey yields or their honey yields, basically. So what we found was that consistently we had about 13 publications that showed that if you have increasing number of beehives, then that's going to increase the amount of honey that you have. And everyone's like, wow, how exciting is that? That's very obvious. But in saying that, it's not always the case. You know, when we increase numbers of beehives, we can also decrease the amount of honey that's coming in per hive if we've got too high stocking rates, which can happen in some places. If you've got too many bees in one location, not enough food. The black lines are what had a good influence, and the grey lines are it didn't have any influence, or it was a negative predictor. So you can see here that in terms of an intervention, and this applies in lots of countries potentially, but with cooperative participation, there's actually no evidence to suggest that if a beekeeper joins a beekeeping co-op, they're going to be better off, which is really interesting. Beekeeping experience obviously had a positive influence on income. And for lots of these other ones, there's only one study there, which is basically, as a scientist, you don't want to go and put all your eggs in one basket. You know, if you find something once, it needs to be repeatable. So we don't want to put all our eggs in any of these baskets here. But what this is showing us is that these are some of the things that we might be looking for in a development program that may influence that. But the key thing that I highlight in the paper that I'm just going to discuss is that very few of these papers, if any, actually talked about the profitability of their enterprise, the resilience of these farmers, and how happy they were being involved in beekeeping. Now, happiness is pretty hard to measure as a scientist, but profitability should be a bit easier. And what I'm interested in doing is, I think that it's something that I hear here in the beekeeping industry as well, is that we always talk about how many numbers of hives we have, but you know, the narrative really needs to be about the profitability. How much are we really making on that? Because we can have as many hives as you like, but doesn't necessarily mean we're better off. So that's some of the research I'm trying to look at. I'm trying to instill that in my own beekeeping business as well. You know, try to keep good records of what's coming in and going out. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about coming up with the 5 pillars are based on a number of publications and a lot of my experiences, but as well, but it's also based in science. There's papers out there. I might get Brock to forward them on to you if you're interested in reading them. Most of them are published in Bee World. You know, this isn't crazy complicated stuff. It's very digestible and it's pretty fun to read. I'm my own worst enemy here, biggest fan. But so this is one of the studies that the 5 pillars draws on. I interviewed and discussed with 52 participants who've been working in beekeeping development, all the biggest names you can think of. And collectively, it draws on more than 750 years of collective beekeeping for development and practitioner experience. So you'd want to hope that over that many years, we've learned some lessons about how to go at actually implementing some of these programs. So this is the first pillar, is technology. And you'll see throughout, I've got these golden numbers. These are the sweet tips. These are the take-home messages, and I'll repeat them again at the end. So the first one is use local bees and local inputs. I can't stress this enough, the amount of times I see communities that have access and been handed all this beekeeping equipment, and as soon as it breaks, they're all dependent on this honey money for their kids to go to school, and then the hives fall apart, and then they don't have that income stream anymore. We need to also think about long-term resilience of these communities. So if we're just giving them stuff, then they're not going to be able to develop that industry themselves. You know, they need to be developing industries that are based around input supplies, like, you know, making boxes and making frames and making queen bees, not just supplying them. So use local bees and local inputs. The first picture here is a beekeeper in Indonesia. This is honey hunting with the giant Asian honeybee, Apis dorsata. That bee is about that big. If I move my hand forward, it gets bigger. But the point I'm making is these bees will kick your ass. They're really big, and a lot of these communities, they don't actually have access to veils and protective equipment. I gave this young man a veil while I was getting smoked on the forest floor, but he's actually about 50 meters in the air there. I was really petrified for his life. Like, it was pretty radical, and these communities are really dependent on this honey money. Totally different bee species. They're not cavity nesting. They don't live in a box. Number 2, that's Apis cerana, the small Asian honeybee. There's a whole bunch of varieties there, but that's, you know, in a coconut log hive. Obviously, you can't check out those combs very easy. And then number 3 here, this is top bar hive beekeeping with Apis mellifera. And then at the bottom there's Apis mellifera beekeeping with Langstroth systems. So you can see there's lots of different systems that are in place here. But the key thing that I want to get across is that if you're ever in a developing country and you see any of these systems, it's just good to remember that not one of these systems is better than another. You know, at a beekeeping conference, yeah, it's one beekeeper, his opinion on, you know, something, you get 10 different opinions on it. You know, it's just what works for you and your system works for you. And until you spend time actually understanding why these people are making the decisions they're making, like, for example, why the hell would you use a log hive? You could do that so much better, right? But the reality is that system actually might be the most profitable enterprise for that beekeeper based on their knowledge, skills, and resources and support. So that's technology. The next point here that I've already sort of talked about is that productivity is not profitability. So Langstroth systems might produce a hell of a lot more honey, but they also cost a lot more money to get started, and there's a lot more risks. And these poor communities might not necessarily be able to take those risks. You know, like I remember when I first started beekeeping, I definitely didn't have the style of system that I have now because I wasn't able to take the same financial risks as I could now, for example. So that's technology. Use local bees and local inputs. Remember, productivity is not profitability. Genetics and bee breeding. So Brock's probably, you'll see his ears perking up here. What's he going to say about this? So the key thing in a development context is to keep bee breeding's programs simple. As we know, we can breed bees for increased productivity, different colors, pest and disease tolerance, their temperament, their ease of handling, hygienic behavior, cleanliness, all sorts of different things. But the key thing here is to focus on those traits that are important to people and which they can actually derive a benefit from. So in Papua New Guinea, this beekeeper on the left here, this guy's name's Wilson Tomato. He's one of the gurus that have been up in PNG for a long, long time. And he's, you know, like he didn't have a very good grafting success on that one, but he did show me some better ones. The key thing here is that Wilson probably won't make much more money if we start developing queen bees up in PNG that have got Varroa tolerance, because people aren't prepared to pay more for them. And that's because people don't know about Varroa tolerance. In fact, they just need to know how to manage Varroa to start with, and actually take it a step back again, how to open up a brood chamber and make sure you got healthy brood. And then they got what their food stores like, you got a healthy young queen. So in saying that, we can go into these countries and set up all these crazy bee breeding programs, but at the end of the day, it needs to have an impact for these people in their pocket. So some of the key skills that these people might want to look at in terms of improving stock is just basically their temperament. You know, a big limitation to people getting into this is cranky bees. You know, a lot of these programs that are happening overseas, or these bee breeders, are not really breeding queen bees as such. They're more multiplying queen bees. So there's a difference there. So if you're breeding queen bees, you're actively keeping good records of particular traits over time and seeing how they improve, not just simply going out to your best hive and picking from it to graft from, that sort of thing. So yeah, focusing on key traits like temperament and honey production, that's the sort of thing that you're going to have a lot more traction with. So keep bee breeding programs simple. Pests and diseases is the next pillar. So we've got the key thing here is to identify, monitor, and manage pests and diseases. The top left photo there, that's a beekeeper down the road from me. He's always got AFB. It's not, it's a frog, I'm just joking. There's about 40 known pests and diseases that impact on honeybees. Obviously, with globalization, we're having lots of different pests and diseases move around the world. So if you rock up in a country and it says there's no Varroa here, well, guess what? There might be. There might also be lots of other things that no one's ever seen before. So when we're turning up in these different areas, it's really important to remember that nothing's static. You know, if you say that Australia doesn't have Varroa, well, you know, I've met a lot of beekeepers that might not know how to identify it very well. And that sort of thing. So you got to really think about who's out there with the eyes looking for these different pests and diseases. Some of these pests and diseases you can't even see with your naked eye. You got to have methods to go and check them out. And lots of them look similar. You got in this photo here, you've got on the right there's a pollen mite, brawler fly, Varroa, and the bottom one's Tropilelaps. Tropilelaps is an absolute nightmare. But actually, even within this, they're very different. So, you know, that Varroa mite there is actually a picture of Varroa jacobsoni, not Varroa destructor. And what's the virus loading in that? Totally different to a different country. That Tropilelaps mite there that we've got research on from other countries is a totally different species that I'm looking at there in PNG. So the key thing here is to be able to understand the difference between infectious and non-infectious diseases, how to identify them, the seasonality of these pests and diseases and how that influence beekeepers' management decisions. And also, if we're going to look at managing them, you know, particularly with chemicals, for example, you know, what's the cost of this for beekeepers? Can they afford it? No point in introducing stuff beekeepers can't afford or won't buy. How effective is it? You know, we can read a package, but what does it actually mean? If you go out there, you know, I've done tests in PNG with the CSIRO here in Australia and looked at the effectiveness of Baverol on Varroa jacobsoni, and it wasn't what was on the packet. So what does that mean? How much do we trust what's on there? I'm not saying don't trust it. I'm just saying be conscious that it might not necessarily be acting in the same way as we think. How's that going to impact on our honey quality and our bee products? What are the challenges with resistance? Is there the education extension services available to roll out that information on how to manage those pests and diseases appropriately? Do people have access to this? You know, if you live at the top of the mountain or somewhere really rural, how are you going to get that sort of materials? And also how they're going to impact on the bee health over time, and also human safety. So that's pests and diseases and bee biosecurity. We talk about this for years, so it's really hard for me to skip over these topics so quickly. So the next one's honeybee nutrition. We can't emphasize this one enough. No trees, no bees, no honey, no money. We're losing trees around the globe faster than we ever have. This is the Anthropocene. We're seeing major changes in our environment with the climate and our access to floral resources globally. And I think beekeepers in the future are going to be a really important means to protecting a lot of these areas and our floral resources. Our livelihoods are dependent on that. So the key thing here is that, you know, obviously bees, they're getting their primary nectar source from these trees, and that's their primary carbohydrate source, and that's turned into honey. And then you've also got pollen, which is their primary protein source, and you've got fats and lipids and amino acids and vitamins and minerals in there. So just like you and I, we don't want bees eating just big McDonald's burgers all day long. Bees need to have a diverse range of food coming into their plate. At home, you need to eat your veggies to be healthy. You need to eat fruit. You need to drink water. You need to, you need to have a really good range of highly nutritious foods. We can't just have a single type of pollen coming in. It's not all pollens are equal of value. In fact, actually, some will set your bees backwards if they're really low in protein, and the bees come out and they're not going to be very strong. And they keep feeding on that into the future. But anyway, so this photo on the left here is awesome. There's so many different coloured pollens coming in there. One beautiful thing working in these tropical areas. It's just the biodiversity. You know, you have such an amazing range of floral resources that are there. So one way we can help beekeepers is obviously to protect the existing flora that we have, identify strategies to enhance new floral resources, particularly those that recover faster after stresses. So if you have a cyclone come through, for example, what are some of the key floral resources coming out just after that to make sure beekeepers are getting back on track? Also, it's good to be able to develop floral calendars. Obviously, flora influences our management decisions. It influences everything in a beekeeping cycle. So developing floral calendars, keeping field diaries, we should all be doing this, keeping record of what we're seeing in the environment, when's it flowering, and most importantly, how is that actually responding in your colony? How is your colony responding to those floral resources over time? And we can start to make better management decisions. Another part is doing some pollen analysis to try and work out what floral resources are really good pollen. So this can be really good for your bee breeding programs and that sort of thing as well. And also appropriate supplementary feeding. So supplementary feeding can be really important. I can't emphasize that enough, but it can also risk honey quality as well if it's not done properly. It can also cost you a hell of a lot of money and get you nowhere. So if you start feeding your bees a lot of sugar syrup and there's no honey flow around the colony, around the corner, basically when you feed bees sugar syrup, that's going to stimulate egg laying from the queen bee. And if you've got heaps of eggs coming out, that means you've got heaps of mouths to feed soon. So if there's no floral resources, you've got to keep feeding until that starts flowering. So you can actually put your bees backwards. You can starve your own bees. You can breed them to death a lot of the time. So it's good to be aware. Some trees don't even produce, like it's super different in some areas. We have some trees here in Australia, I'm not sure about overseas, Ohio, Indiana, and that if you have some floral resources there that don't even produce pollen for the bees, you can keep them there and they just keep breeding up, but there's no pollen to breed themselves out. Anyway, so that's honeybee nutrition, really important stuff. And the next one is education and extension. So I've actually divided this, I've been a bit cheeky, I've divided this into 3 different sections. So training, education, extension, quality assurance and marketing, and risk, inclusivity and vulnerability. So the key thing with this is that this is the human dimension. This is the social paradigm. The key thing with this point at the top here is that we need to think about who our beneficiaries are. Believe it or not, I know this is going to be really hard for me to convince you lot, but not everyone wants to do beekeeping, right? So this is the same overseas. We can't just expect that because people are poor that they're going to want to get into bees, right? Like I got to just accept that my partner doesn't want to come out and go beekeeping with me. That's okay, but she might want to do something else in the apiary or, with other products and that sort of thing. So what actually defines a good beekeeper? Someone that's really passionate about the environment, about trees, about flora, that actually thinks bees are interesting. Like they look at the bee and they go, wow, how cool is that? They're actually fascinated about it. Most beekeepers are pretty fascinated about bees. And I'll tell you another thing that they're good at doing, like most successful beekeepers can identify a mentor. I had one. I'm sure lots of you had a mentor too, and they help you throughout different changing seasons. So you need to identify who are going to be your beneficiaries, not just select anyone for the sake of it, and have ongoing mentorship, someone there to help you throughout the changing seasons over time. So that's that first part of that. The next part of the training extension side of it is to ensure that the training is outcome based and has got a practical focus. So I don't know how many more training days you've got to go to, and at the end of it, no one can open up a beehive. Seriously, it's just outrageous. So we need to make sure that training is outcome based. And what that means is basically you don't get a certificate of approval that you're a competent beekeeper until you can actually demonstrate the skill. You actually need to go and light a smoker for me to say you can light a smoker. So, and I think that's, yeah, it seems obvious, but we see this a lot of the time, you know, that beekeeping can be very convoluted. There's so much information out there. It needs to be practical. We need to have hands-on experience, get people in the apiary. One of the dot points there I've got is in the middle is focus on core skills. So what are those skills that beekeepers have already mentioned some of these things? What do they really need to know? Do they need to know about, you know, the age of a drone and when it's going to be, you know, ready for doing artificial insemination? Probably not on their first day, you know, but yet you might go into a beginning beekeeping course and people are talking about this. You sit there going, like, what we really need to think about here is how to open a beehive, light a smoker, how to check for capped and uncapped honey, how to make sure, you know, you can identify if you got eggs, spot a queen, identify the main brood diseases. So just some of these core skills that beekeepers need to be able to run, and also a couple of business management skills as well. What are those fundamental skills? So it's really important to work with beekeeping instructors, not go in there and give training, but actually support local people in local countries to solve their own problems ultimately. They need to be there long term after people leave. You know, we're not going in as saviors, so they're there to solve their own problems, and they're very capable of doing that. A really good thing can be to get beekeeping trainers together. You can do this anywhere in the world. It's an amazing, beneficial thing to do. You get beekeepers who are trainers to give each other peer-to-peer feedback. Feedback is such a beautiful thing. As researchers, we get it all the time, and often it's a pretty intense process, but you know, it can be a really great thing to get lots of trainers into the same room, do a presentation that's theoretical, give a practical demonstration, and then get the team to give you some feedback about how you can improve. How else are we going to get better in life? And the other thing there is to just, to try to, focus on the practical and then involve educational institutions. We need go out there, talk to schools, get kids involved, make sure that the universities in lots of these areas have got young researchers. You know, what Brock's doing is an amazing service for the country in lots of ways. We need young minds out there that are keen to, you know, be of support to the beekeeping industries and that sort of thing. The next one's quality assurance and marketing. So the key thing here is to strengthen honey value chain linkages. And what do I mean by a value chain? So a supply chain is when you basically produce a product and expect that people are going to want it without talking to them. You know, that's like me making my partner dinner and just expecting that she's going to like it. You know, if it's just my favorite dinner, it doesn't always work like that. We need to think about what the consumer wants. We also need to think about who else makes this product successful all the way along that value chain, so that we can enhance those relationships to make things easier for one another and work with each other. And that's the best way to improve the profitability and sustainability of any enterprise. So it's good to have a market in mind before you start. You know, there's no point in producing heaps of, you know, soap or something like that if there's already heaps of cheap soap available. Like, I mean, how are you going to compete with that unless you're doing lots of good marketing and that sort of thing? So you really have got to have a good end market in mind. Everyone wants to export honey, and everyone thinks that if we just get an export market, I'm going to just get double the price for my honey without having to do anything, you know. And I don't know how many people, I talk to people just down the road from me that think of this. Look, you can do that, and lots of people overseas are saying, let's export this honey, and it can be really important, and sometimes you can reach market saturation, but more often than not, local markets are actually the most suitable, and you'll get the best price, and there's also the least amount of input costs and effort required to get it to that market. Generally speaking, I know for myself, I'd love to try Indiana honey and some honey from Ohio, but generally speaking, when I'm here, I like my local honey. And most people where you are, they want to buy your honey because it's local a lot of the time. So it's something to keep in mind too. yeah, so the key thing here is to strengthen those honey value chain linkages. And this is the last one, and then we'll get on to some questions and you can hassle me with heaps of those. So the last one is risk. And any beekeeping business should be thinking about risk. This is about inclusivity and vulnerability. So we need to be actively inclusive and conscious of vulnerability. When we're talking about some of the programs that I'm working in, and this should be part of, lots of programs in any country, is what are the people who may be missing out and that are not involved. So I'm involved in lots of gender justice programs in beekeeping in overseas. We're trying to get women more involved in beekeeping and youth, veterans, and marginalized groups without land. What are the indicators of success here? We can't just talk about, this lady's name is Henno. She lives in PNG. I can't just say on a piece of paper that she's got more, she knows, she's got more hives now, for example. That's not necessarily an indicator of success that we were talking about at the start. What are the skills that she has? What are the skills that she wants to achieve? What are her aspirations? What is it that she needs to be able to run a successful bee business? What's her relationships like with the people in the industry that are either going to enable or disable her to get to where she wants to go? Is she going to be able to have access to training, or is she going to be excluded from it? How's she going to feel when she's in those training days? This goes for any country. What are the structures that are in place? Do any of those industry boards actually have a mechanism for making sure there's inclusivity? Because inclusivity and diversity, I manage big projects, I'm telling you, it's not just a box ticking exercise. We do this because diversity means creativity and complexity of ideas to form the best solutions. We need to be inclusive. We need to be inclusive for lots of reasons, not just because it's the right thing to do. The next part of this is shocks, trends, and seasonality. So what are the shocks that are in place for your market, for your productivity? How are you going to handle that in terms of your income? What are the trends in the market? What are the trends in terms of, basically not just market trends, but also in terms of populations of different pests and diseases and things like that. And also seasonality. So, how do changes from season to season impact on your beekeeping enterprise from year to year? If you have a big drought and you've got lots of beekeepers that are, heavily dependent on your beekeeping incomes, and what sort of systems do we have in place? Like, I mean, does the industry, in the States, does the beekeeping industries levy money from honey production to have a bank of money there that's available in case there's a natural disaster, so you can supplementary feed your bees? Something like that. There's lots of different systems that you can have in place. This photo on the right there, that guy's name's Jonah Booker. He's an amazing beekeeper. We were doing an experiment here in PNG, and there was an earthquake, and we went back the next day, and all these beehives are on the ground. I'm telling you, there's some seriously cranky bees that day. All right, so yeah, I'll wrap it up now. So these are my sweet tips. Use local bees and local inputs. Productivity is not profitability. Keep bee breeding programs simple. We need to learn to identify, monitor, and manage pests and diseases. Remember, honeybee nutrition. No trees, no bees, no honey, no money. Keep in mind who your beneficiaries are and who you're working with. Make sure that they've got ongoing mentorship throughout different changing seasons. Ensure that training is outcome-based and has a practical focus on core skills that are going to actually mean more honey, more profitability, and more welfare for those communities. Try and strengthen those honey value chain linkages along the chain there, from the honey packers, not just the beekeepers themselves, but the people that collect the honey, that process the honey, that package and sell the honey, the marketers, the consumers, everyone. And be actively inclusive and conscious of vulnerability. So they're the 5 pillars for successful agricultural development: education, extension, honeybee nutrition, pests and diseases, genetics, and technology. Thanks everyone for joining in.
Great, thank you. I wrote down a few questions here. So before we get to questions, I just wanted to, we've got a lot of people here, and just to keep on top of them all, feel free to use the chat if you do have a question, folks. You can just write it in there, and then when I see it, we can acknowledge it, and then you can unmute yourself and ask it. Alternatively, if you'd just like to ask your question, there is, if you click the participants icon in the bottom, you should be able to click something that says raise hand. So you see up in my top left, I've raised my hand, and then I can lower it. So just to keep things sane, we'll do that. As you get used to that system, I'm going to steal the first question. So that was great, thank you. And one of your pillars, or one of your sweet tips, was using local bees. So I find that really interesting in the systems that you're working in, because the local bees are often two different species or two or more different species. So what do you find in areas where you have two different native or one native, one non-native apis species, that there's a preference for one or the other, or there's an economic benefit to using one or the other?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, Brock. And there's, yeah, we've got lots of things sort of firing off in my mind about how to answer that. There's lots of different considerations to think about in this process. So, yeah, part of it is where you are. So, if you're introducing a type of honeybee, usually if any honeybees are being introduced, it's going to be Apis mellifera. But in some countries, you've actually introduced other types of honeybees as well. As we know, lots of areas where we have honeybees, they're not native, and they can have a really big impact on the native bee assemblages there. So it's good to be just conscious of that and how that's going to impact and roll out in terms of, supporting the natural floral resources there in comparison to the benefits that could have for the communities that are there. And then, so in terms of preference for those, basically it's like sort of saying, why do some beekeepers use jumbos and some beekeepers use 8 frames and some use, 10s? It's kind of like whatever suits you and what you have access to and money. Like I don't run bees on pallets here because I don't have money to have a forklift, because I don't have a big enough truck. And so like if we take that all the way down to a different scale, you might be in a forest in Sumbawa, Indonesia, and you might think, right, I really want to get into Langstroth beekeeping, but at this stage I've only got a bit of timber and a handsaw, so I'm going to try and make some top bar hives. That's all you got. That's the best that they can do at that point in time in life. So yeah, often I think the key message is though that we don't just say that, when we go into these places that what they should do. We can't just go in and tell the beekeeper that doesn't even own a handsaw, to try and put yourself in a mindset where you don't even own a handsaw is pretty hard to do, and if you could say to that person, you should be doing Langstroth beekeeping, you're like, this could be a really big jump that they're not ready to take. This could actually create a lot of problems. But there's also the biosecurity aspect as well. So when we're moving bees around, we have to be really conscious about the bee biosecurity issues. Does that answer your question? I could talk about this for ages.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, I mean, you work in such variable areas that I imagine the answer varies as well. Oh geez. Okay, so we've got a few here. I'm going to start in order. So John Haggy, I'm sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong. If you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask this question that you dropped or this comment that you've got in there, John. If not, I can ask it. Give you a minute. Okay, so okay, so John is saying, a friend who runs an orphanage school, social center in Liberia. Do you have any resources or tips for John, as a beekeeper to help them support themselves with beekeeping? So do you have any tips, I guess beyond the ones you shared today, on folks running an orphanage school, social center in Liberia?
Yeah. Well, I guess in addition to the tips that I've got here, like a part of it is just being relatable and having fun. If you're there, you don't need to make ongoing relationships with people. And so if you're there, particularly with an orphanage, like my supervisor throughout my PhD, he set up an orphanage in Timor-Leste. And I remember going up to that area. We weren't allowed to go to the orphanage. Why? Because why would you want to create bonds and relationships with some kids that they're just going to be heartbroken when you leave? And so I think for an orphanage, if you have beekeepers that are going there, be committed to them, be committed to the relationship, and have an ongoing sort of mechanism to support them. But yeah, I'd love to catch up with you and hear more about it. It sounds like an amazing venture and an amazing thing that they're doing there. That's excellent. Thanks for the question.
I've got one here from Ted Parks. Ted, if you want to ask this, you're more than welcome to. I'll give you a second to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can just jump on it. Alrighty, so Ted Parks is asking, some of the NGOs support beekeeping. Some NGOs support beekeeping and you can donate to them. And by so doing, you buy bees to create income for developing communities and developing countries. Does this work? Are they supported? So.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ted. Yeah, so they do work. Ultimately they do work, but also in some contexts they don't work. So it's a pretty hard thing to sort of summarize, in some of the programs that I've been involved in. I've seen a whole range of different successes, and also I've gone through lots of things that didn't work. I think the key thing is that if you're contributing to an organization that's doing something like that, but just make sure that you have a look at what their principles and practices are and who's there doing what, before we sort of just go, handing out funds to support bees overseas. It's good to know that the people that are working in that space are really committed to it, that they got a good understanding of the communities that are there and the beekeepers that are there and that sort of thing as well. Like I wouldn't just come to the States and start giving advice about how to do beekeeping. Who would I? It'd be crazy. This is the same sort of thing, in any other country as well. If you got someone who's been, like I feel like I can speak on behalf of some beekeeping industries. I've spent more than a year living there, working bees every day. But if you got, so I guess, they do work. Lots of the time they have some amazing impacts for communities. But I also have to be, the devil's advocate here and say we need to be conscious that if we don't, include a lot of these sweet tips that we've put on here, they can actually do more harm than good.
Cooper, I was actually curious about this as well. So there have been programs, I don't know, have you worked a lot in Africa at all?
No, I haven't done a lot of work in Africa. And the reason for that is, you go.
No, go ahead.
Well, part of the reason for that is, there's a lot of groups working there. And the other thing is that it's quite a long way for me to fly. It's much easier for me to work in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But also, I also feel like there's an amazing opportunity to do good in those areas with the bee industries because they just don't have a lot of support.
Yeah, but so I guess a trend I see in some of these NGOs in Africa is that they tend to purchase non-native honeybee subspecies. So they'll bring in Italian bees into an area where you've got Apis mellifera and Adansonii, Apis mellifera scutellata. They've got these wonderful native stocks, but they're bringing in Italian bees. I'm wondering, are you seeing kind of the same there? Do you see the same kind of thing in the countries that you're working in?
Africa's a pretty big country. It's probably easier to move things across the country. Some of the places I work, you have to get on 355 planes and then 200 boats. And then, that's after I've ridden a kangaroo to the airport. So, I guess we do see that. We see a lot of communities, obviously lots of beekeeping industries are really keen to get their hands on new genetics. In some places, it's really worthwhile doing. And it can have a really big impact on the quality of the bees that they're working, because a lot of the beekeeping industries, they don't have, ongoing bee breeding programs. So lots of the stock there are pretty wild. They sting you, they're propolising everything. They're not producing a lot of honey. They're pretty, hard to work with, but they probably are pretty well adapted to the local pressures that are there and the local context of pests and diseases and the climate that's there as well. So we do see some sort of movements of genetics. But in saying that, a lot of these island areas that we work, it's harder to get things there. But what we want to do is to be able to improve the biosecurity practices that are in place and the skills of local beekeepers and their knowledge, so that they don't go and illegally import stuff. Because when you start doing that, there's a lot going on that, you can spend a long time reading about some of the risks, potentially of introducing different viruses and that sort of thing.
That is a great lead into Brent Ruggeber's question. So Brent, if you want to unmute yourself and ask about AAA Labs, you're more than welcome to. I'll give you a second here. Otherwise, I can ask it for you.
Sure, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hey Brent.
Yep. Hi. The background behind my question is I am planning a move to the Philippines and to become a commercial beekeeper full time. And I've got family over there already, and I'm a little bit concerned about taking my beekeeping practices from here, moving them over there, and managing these hives in a way that will still produce honey in a quantity that will support me and my family. And I'm a little nervous about these mites. I've heard a lot about potential use of formic acid in some ways, and a lot of brood breaks. What is your experience? I know they're in Papua New Guinea, but how are things looking for you?
Yeah, really, really great question, Brent. And best of luck moving over the Philippines. I'm sure you're having a wild time there. It'll be unreal. That'd be fantastic. You've got a lot of beekeeping technical skills to support your industry around there that'll be really valuable to you, no doubt. I know a commercial beekeeper from Australia that's moved to the Philippines, so he might be a good contact too. Feel free to send me an email after this. I can put you two in touch.
I would love that.
Yeah, I think one thing to be conscious of there too, like the main thing is that we have expectations of stacking bee boxes really high in a lot more temperate areas. In the tropical areas, you have flora that tends to produce nectar more steadily over a longer period of time. So you have more consistent harvesting periods, but of a lesser quantity. The humidity is another thing that can be a challenge. But in terms of tropical alaps, you have tropical alaps Clariae, that my experience is mostly with Mercedes. They're very similar, but it's just good to be conscious that there are differences. Tropical alaps breed twice as fast. They run around 100 miles an hour. I might even just share my screen for those who don't know what I'm talking about. Can everyone see this picture here? Right, I'm just gonna, I don't know if this will work, but I've got a video here. This is in PNG. This is of some varroa mites running around. This is Varroa jacobsoni. You can see them running around on the bee. This next video I'm going to show you is tropical alaps. So I want you to see how fast those mites are moving around on that bee.
Yes.
All right. Watch how fast these mites are running around. Those bees don't look very happy, do they?
No.
No, it's a real pain, particularly when you have them in combination. And what you mentioned was really correct in terms of a break in the brood cycle. So one thing that I've found, I can link a publication to Brock if anyone's interested in reading this. I did an experiment in PNG looking at some non-chemical ways to manage the mites up there for a range of reasons. One being that people don't have access to chemicals and that sort of thing. But if you cage a queen bee for 28 days, you'll have a break in your brood cycle. So obviously a drone bee is going to hatch on day 24, right? And then you've got about 3 days there at least where you've got no brood in the colony. Now, the difference between tropical alaps and varroa mite is that varroa mite can feed on an adult bee, and they can reproduce living on an adult bee, whereas tropical alaps cannot. Their mouth parts are not developed enough to actually be able to feed off their adult bee. So what happens is they actually need the brood at all times. So if you have that break in that period, the tropical alaps, because of their biology, they starve to death after about 24 hours. So within about 48 hours, you're going to see a really significant decline in that population. So what you're going to need to be doing is having an integrated pest management strategy, which I'm sure you're no doubt over the ball with already with your current operations, but ultimately it's just about including some sort of a mechanism to be able to, create those broodless periods potentially, whether you can integrate that into your actual management strategies and that sort of thing, doing cut down splits or however you go. There's 100 ways you can go about making broodless periods, not just caging the queen. So yeah, that's part of it. And also just looking at, how effective your treatment options are and that sort of thing, what varroa you've got there and the virus loadings of that varroa as well. We find that, some of the check mite that's going actually is one of the only chemicals that can actually penetrate through the cell wall capping, which can be really beneficial as well in those settings. But I hope that answers your question. I can link a publication, and I can link you to that beekeeper that's in the Philippines as well, if that's of interest, bro.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure how to contact you. I'm new to this.
If anyone, I'll put this in the chat. If anyone would like to reach out to Cooper, you can go through me and I can connect you. And I'm just doing this because my email is really easy. It's honeybee@purdue.edu. So there it is in the chat if you need it. And then I can connect you directly with Cooper.
Thank you.
No worries at all. There's another question here. This one from Dr. Jordan Lee. And she's wondering about, what non-wood materials have you seen in your experience being used for for beehives?
Ooh,
So what kind of variation in colony materials?
Non-wood hives, that's a good question. Oh man, you see some really interesting things. People are very creative. I'll tell you, really creative beekeepers, like if you've got a problem, they'll come up with some sort of solution that costs nothing. It's amazing, I've seen beehives made out of things that are just like plastic that's washed up on the beach, like in these round drums. and they've got bees in there they're taking combs out of. I've also been in a situation where I've been in such rural areas where, you know, like you just don't have timber resources. They don't have mills, so they'd be, you know, making hives out of, you know, sticks, and then they use their traditional weaving skills. I'll tell you what, these people can weave like no tomorrow. They could weave anything. They could weave you a bridge that, you know, you could drive your truck over. And they put together a hive, and then, you know, find some sticks that you can cut up. You might have a handsaw, and then just put some top bars on it, and you come back a year later, it's just made out of, you know, mud and sticks. Obviously you got post-harvest handling challenges there, but also where's the market, and what are people's understanding of that? I don't think they're going to be obviously that worried about it, but once the honey doesn't, the bees actually don't join the comb to the mud anyway. But yeah, so that's some of the wildest things that I've seen. It's pretty amazing. I've got a couple of photos I could link into if you're interested. I've got a bit of a file of crazy hives.
Thanks. Yeah, there's another one here from Jerry Zimmerman. Jerry, do you want to ask this? Do you want me to? There you go.
I can. Around here, if you get a few beekeepers together, pretty soon, you know, we have a club. And I guess there it might be a co-op or whatever, but are you finding them becoming more interested in forming co-ops or local groups to help each other?
That's an excellent question, Jerry. And it looks awfully cold where you are. I can't believe you're sitting outside at the moment.
A Zoom background, but outside is pretty much the same way right now.
Yeah, so beekeepers do form clubs and they do form associations. And I guess whenever in any of my work research questions, I always, I just liken it to my own situation. You know, who would you form a club, like who would you join in a club with, or an association, or a partnership in a beekeeping program or a business? People that you trust. You know, like I would struggle to let a lot of people in on my bee business, even though I'd like to expand, just for a whole range of reasons. Not that I wouldn't want to, but just there's a whole heap of complications with that. In terms of associations, for me, you know, like I participate in like the Northern Beekeepers Association. I'm a member, you know, on the board with the New South Wales Apis Association. I work with the Australian Honeybee Industry Council, etc. But for me, I don't get heaps of value out of going to, you know, the Amateur Beekeepers Association down the road, because I like to catch up with everyone. I love everyone that's down there, absolute legends. But you know, for the amount of time that I have, so I guess it comes back to how much value you get out of it. We all have lots of values. So part of it is belonging to something. Some of it is being heard and listened to, about sharing your own knowledge and information. Some of it's about accessing information and resources, or sharing resources. But in lots of other countries, they don't. Lots of the countries I work with, they don't necessarily have access to good governance, good, you know, handling of a lot of these things. And so what happens is that a lot of beekeepers don't actually derive a lot of value from lots of these systems, and they could work really well. And in some cases they do. Small scale, localized systems work. So one thing that we're trialing at the moment in Fiji is we got, you know, access to extractors is a pain in the ass. You know, we've got people moving honey all over the place and buses. And I'll tell you, if you put bees on buses, you're not making many friends to take your honey down to the extraction place. So, you know, what we're trying to do is we're trying to rent out these extraction processing facilities where people can go and hire the extraction equipment and then go and sell it at the market, where they go, you know, the honey co-op, whatever, downtown. But they actually have to pay a small subcommittee of people that they trust a user fee, so that when it breaks, they've got access to funds to repair it. It's that sort of thing. So, yep, there can be lots of pros. Also, can be really challenging. Great question, Jerry.
I don't see any more in the chat. Folks, if you have a question, do feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand. But that's probably just a good, Jerry, yeah, go ahead.
I have a slightly different question, well, a considerably different question. I'm a biologist, and I'm always fascinated with the way here plants and bees have evolved so that as one nectar pollen source is coming off, another one is coming on, and that pretty much continues April through late June. What is that like in in a tropical country like PNG, where pretty much the plants can grow and flower all the time, in my mind. How does that, how does the nectar flow work there? Do you have peaks? I'm sure you must.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good, great question. And it's kind of like saying, you know, what's the flow like where I live in comparison to up near, you know, northern Australia, for example. You know, like I can't really generalize too much for the whole of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, because it's such a radical, you know, diversity of climatic situations and flora. But one thing I'd say is it's absolutely fascinating, and you would absolutely dig it. You know, like it's amazing the floral diversity that's there. It's just fantastic. But the thing that's really challenging as a beekeeper is you sit there and you go, wow, these bees are working something and I have no idea what it is. So you gotta be, yeah, it's a real challenge. You know, you got to be on the ball and keeping good records and that sort of thing. But like with Brent's question just earlier about in the Philippines, you know, one thing that we do see in the tropics is that you do have a more consistent honey flow that comes. And that you don't stack your boxes so high, and people are like, oh, you don't know what you're doing. You don't even have many boxes on your hive. You know, you're not working bees good enough or whatever. But actually, that's just part of their system. They actually pull in high, you know, boxes of honey off more frequently throughout the year. And another thing that really determines flowering patterns in the tropics is that, you know, they don't have 4 seasons, but they've got 2 pretty main ones: the wet season and the dry season. So they're our main key switches in the environment for major floral resource changes and variability. But in saying that, one thing I really want to emphasize is how many conversations I've had with rural farmers who cannot predict when the hell these rains are coming. They've been there for so long. They could tell you the day it's coming. These people are so in tune with the environment. And increasingly, every year, I'm hearing more and more, we don't know what's coming. These flowers are doing something weird. These flowers shouldn't be in flower now. And it's a real challenge, because a lot of our people in these poorest countries are going to feel the brunt of what we're doing in Western worlds first. It's pretty radical, and it really changes the way you're managing bees and farming systems, and yeah, lots of other things too. But yeah, great question, Jerry.
So we've just got one more. This one was sent privately from Camilla. Camilla, if you'd like to ask this, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, I can. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi there. I just had a question about, I am a part of bee meetings and things of that sort. But what kind of careers can you pick? I just have one hive, that's it. And or travel experiences where you can go to different cultures and see what people are doing, kind of what you're doing. It sounds like you go to different countries and you see a complete different setup. And how do you get involved with something like that?
That's a really good question, Camilla. And I really like your motorbike in the back. That's excellent. I'm right into my bike riding as well. That's fantastic.
I always bring my motorcycle inside because I don't have a heated shop to work on it.
Well, I don't have that problem here in northern New South Wales. I just leave my bike outside all the time. It's fine. It just kicks over every time. Yeah. So how to get involved in beekeeping for development?
Yep.
You know, for me, I think the most important thing is that obviously you have to have like I was saying before, a real passion for this. You know, like I live and breathe this stuff every single day. Lots of my friends think that I just go overseas on holidays all the time, you know, but actually you have to be realistic with yourself with this, because actually living in lots of these places is very challenging. These are very poor countries with lots of risks. You know, just for me to drink water and to get around safely in some of these places that I work is a major challenge. This is really challenging stuff. And a lot of the time, the bees are the easy thing. It's the people that are really quite challenging in these systems. We need to work with lots of the institutional structures that exist there and the social structures that are there. And it makes it a lot of fun as well, you know, in lots of ways. So I think a key way to get involved is reach out to people like me who are in this field. Obviously, we have projects going on all around the place. It's good to be able to just be clear about what skills you have to offer. You know, like if we need support for a particular type of skill within an industry, let's say you're amazing at developing value-added bee products, and we want to run value-added bee products in some places. That's an amazing skill. You know, we need to be able to reach out and say, okay, who out there can do these sorts of things? but also being realistic about, how we can support that long term. You can be in contact with a number of different aid organizations and agencies and that sort of thing. And you can also reach out to local beekeeping associations that actually live in these countries, depending on whether you want to pursue this as an interest or work. You know, you can reach out and say, hey, how's it going? What are you doing? Can I help you? You know, they might say, yeah, we're running a queen bee breeding day and we've got no training resources. And you might be able to go, well, I might be able to put something together, you know, and that sort of thing. So there's no real short answer to the question. There's lots of ways that you can go about this. We wear lots of different hats. Sometimes I'm a practitioner and I work for an aid organization. I do train the trainer programs. Sometimes I'm there and I'm doing research to understand what's happening and what's really going on. So you can go down a path of, you know, studying environmental science or, you know, development studies at a university and go through the research pathway. We can develop your sort of technical skills and make yourself of value and get yourself registered on some of those big NGOs, like even FAO, you know, and that sort of thing. Sign up, put your name down as having beekeeping experience. I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So we are coming up to time here. Well, actually, we're at time, folks. So if you have any more, I don't want to absorb too much of Cooper's day today. But if you do have any more, if you're interested in reaching out to him, my contact is honeybee@purdue.edu, and I can connect you. And Cooper, I'll give you the last word here too. There's also a very simple survey. It's a Purdue Impact Survey in the chat. That just helps us assess how useful these webinars are to you, and kind of helps us move our extension offerings around a little bit to match your need. So if you could fill that out, it's really helpful, but don't feel obliged. Cooper, you have the last word. Go for it.
Well, thanks, team. I really just appreciate your time and your interest. Honestly, it means the world to me to be able to share some of the things I'm passionate about and trying to change, you know, the way that some of these systems work and trying to create positive change for the environment and communities. But yeah, I'd say if you're in a developing country or you've got any questions about this, please be in touch. If you just type in my name, leaving Cooper, and then the word bees, something will come up. You should be able to be in contact some way. The Bees for Sustainable Livelihoods research group, where they're sort of developing that. There's going to be a website launch soon. There's some media stuff online. If you want to check that out on Instagram and Facebook and that sort of thing, we do posts about where we are and what we're doing, that sort of thing, if you're of interest. I'll send through some papers too to Brock if they're of interest to you. Feel free to have a read of them. And yeah, hopefully if I'm in the States, I want to reach out to you guys and come and say hey and check out your operations. And until then, yeah, happy beekeeping.
We'll get you here for an Indiana bee school in February. It'll be nice and cold for you.
Sounds great. I'd love that. I do own a jumper somewhere.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.